All right, let's jump right into it. Diana, just some very quick table setting. I recognize that gender is a social construct, but we're increasingly understanding that all gender, including trans and NB identities, are steeped in biology. So, is it fair then to say that non cis and non binary identities have always been part of human society?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm working on a book right now about the history of non-binary gender and stuff. It'll be out next year, so pre-order will be hopefully around this time in a year. Um, but one of the things I found when I was doing that research was that there is a long history of gender nonconforming and trans people going back to the Egyptian Empire and the Roman Empire. There was a long held tale of an Egyptian man who cut off his own penis and then said to his wife, "Hey, I'm like you now," and stuff. And it's not sure if that's a trans story, but it seems to be read as that.
Mm,
And then over in Japan, we have people who have been depicted in their history as both male and female. The founder of Kabuki was assigned female at birth, but cross-dressed a lot to the point where statues that depict them often depict them as a male samurai, which is really fascinating. And probably my favorite story is the story of Elagabalus, a young emperor of Rome who offered the kingdom's fortunes basically to anybody who could turn them into a woman, which is
mm-hmm.
really fascinating. And so we know going back centuries that we've been here forever. So
Yeah.
there have been people, even before we had the technology to have those surgeries and stuff, we've been around.
Yeah, no question. And I know that our culture is struggling, honestly, in a lot of ways to broaden our model a little bit. And we are still kind of stuck in this false dichotomy of male and female. So, what are some of the ways that past cultures have worked to conceptualize or understand these ideas?
You find a lot of different, like, we call them third genders, but they're basically just a different form of gender in a
Hmm.
lot of Native American cultures. They're captured as a whole by the name Two Spirit, which means different things depending on which tribe, depending on which area of the country that you're in. And in other cultures, other countries, we find all sorts of flexibility around gender roles and ideas of who is male, who is female. One thing that I emphasize in my book, and I take a very westernized approach to gender because that's the culture I'm steeped in,
Sure.
but what we view as these set normative roles are not so. And so I lived in Japan for a year about 10 years ago, and the ways in which male and female were considered divided from each other were very different from Western ideas of
Mm.
it. Like my male students carried pink backpacks and stuff, which was a surprise to my Westernized view and stuff. So I found that gender tends to be very flexible depending on your culture.
I'm always fascinated by that. I've read stories. I'm certainly not an expert here, but looking back to recognize that what we think of as like baby blue, baby boy
Mhm.
blue, and baby pink, those were basically flipped prior to World War II, as I
Yeah,
understand it. And these things that are supposed to be like hard set in our biology are anything but. And I just find that absolutely fascinating. Do you have any other examples or models for us of two or three or more gendered societies from the past?
not off the top of my head, but
Sure.
I do want to mention one of my favorite non-binary people who shows up in Western culture in colonial America. In the Quaker tradition, there was this person who imagined themselves a prophet of God who called themselves the public universal friend and refused to be referred to by any pronouns. They were the friend.
Hmm.
They were not she, her, they wasn't really a singular quite yet. So if they had been there, they might have done that. But they insisted that they encapsulated both male and female. And this was somebody who existed in colonial times, and like the way that culture reacted to them was basically reacting to them as a prophet, not necessarily as a
Sure.
non-gender thing. Like gender
Yeah.
wasn't a part of it for the controversy that they caused. And I just sort of
Yeah, I
loved
could
how
imagine that the claiming to be like the voice of God was slightly more important to those people.
Yeah, and
It is
yet
this interesting
today
thing.
that's a more common claim, and a claim that I think that is maybe more accepted by at least certain subsects of society, which is just baffling to me. But it does raise an interesting question here, because I feel like whenever we do one of these conversations and we talk about like these moments from history, we kind of pull out these like individual case studies, and it can be really easy to dismiss those and just be like, well, yeah, every society has a bunch of crazies. What does that actually mean? And it's frustrating and it's heartbreaking to realize that in our modern Western society, so much of the history that has come down to us has been thoroughly edited and heavily revised to specifically exclude these things. So often what we have is just kind of little scraps and bits and pieces. Can you illuminate that for us at all? I mean, are we reaching here when we talk about these stories?
No, not at all. The transgender and non-binary history is one, unfortunately, of violence and erasure. One of the most important events that happened within our history was the 1933 sacking of the Institute for Sexuality in Berlin, where there was literally decades of research on homosexuality, transgender identity, although it wasn't called that, it was called cross-dressing and transvestitism. And stuff. But in 1933, the Nazis came to power, and one of the things that they did, like almost immediately, was to go in and destroy that body of knowledge. They killed a couple of trans people who were at the institute, and they burned all the books that were there, all the research that had been done, every study that had been put together. So all the body of knowledge that we had at that time was just lost. And they had started performing surgeries at that point. So all the surgical knowledge that we had, some of it was preserved through survivors, but a lot of it was lost. So we had to essentially, after World War II, start back again from zero.
Actual Nazis keeping us from understanding our gender. Tell me if you've heard this one before. It's it's absolutely heartbreaking. How have non-binary identities been considered in our own society at various times in history?
It's hard because we didn't have the words for it for so long, and cultural memory tends to only go back about 60 years. So like we barely remember Christine Jorgensen, who was the first American trans woman to go get surgery. And for so long with the way trans identity was medicalized, what it meant was that you had to meet certain criteria to ever get surgery. So people who were non-binary, who existed as that, aren't necessarily recorded as that in history, largely because history is kept by cis people. And the medical programs required you to have a binary identity, because they use the language of I am a man trapped in a woman's body, or I'm a woman trapped in a man's body, sort of binarism that meant that non-binary people who didn't feel necessarily that they were binary either had to transition all the way into that opposite gender, or they had to find some other way to DIY it. And we don't have a lot of those records. One of the most famous probably is the writer Leslie Feinberg, who wrote a fictionalized narrative of their own life, of her own life, in Stone Butch Blues, where they talk about, there's a character named Jess who sort of halfway transitions and then quote unquote desists, but is happy in their non-binary space.
Mm-hmm. Well, I feel like the objections that are already, streaming in from a small percentage of the audience, and the thing that I got so tired of hearing that I eventually just wrote a blog post about it so that I could write that URL on my business card rather than actually having a conversation with people, because I got sick of going to cocktail parties. And when people found out I was a sex therapist, the first thing they wanted to do was talk to me about, trans folks in bathrooms and trans folks in sports. And so I put some research together pointing out the fact that the science of sex is not just XX and XY. And we've tried so hard to discuss that on this show and to get that idea out there. But people are really desperate, I think, to hold on to these really biblically grounded oversimplifications. So I'm really interested then in how Christianity specifically has impacted our views on gender historically.
Yeah, the thing about the way Christianity works in our American culture is that it's evangelicalism that has really taken hold and sort of made that no true Scotsman, where like you aren't really a Christian unless you hold these very specific evangelical beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
And I come from a background of theology. I was raised Baptist, studied at a small Baptist college, and then went to grad school at Baylor in Texas. And one thing that I've learned is that a lot of evangelicalism, a lot of our current Christianity is reaction to the civil rights movement. It's a reaction to Black people getting more rights in the mainstream. The first sex ed classes that happened were to prevent race mixing. That was part of the thing that they wanted to stop.
Fantastic. What a legacy for me to jump into as a sex educator. So glad we're all here.
Christy, you have to work specifically to get mixed couples together now. You know that you have to undo that. No,
I'm right on it. I'm in a monogamous relationship, Rudy. I'm not looking to mix any. Oh, that's not what you meant. Never mind. I'm sorry, Diana. Please continue.
But one of the things is it's this imposition of whiteness onto society. Basically, it's all part and parcel of white supremacy, where evangelicals saw what was happening in the civil rights movement and the feminist and womanist movements at that same time in the 60s and went, okay, we need a moral pushback against this. And so we're going to lean hard into gender roles and waiting until marriage, because that wasn't really a thing all that much until that time, until good old Jerry Falwell hopped in there.
Jerry Falwell. So glad we're having these conversations.
Oh, wait, what am I missing about this Jerry person? What am I missing?
He founded Liberty University in Virginia. He was the guy who started the moral majority movement in the 80s.
Gotcha.
Yeah. I'll send you the link to the episode that we did on the history of purity culture with Dr. Darrell Ray. I'll make sure to put that in the footnotes for everybody else, but we'll get Rudy caught back up to speed. It's worth pointing out that Liberty is a university, I'm using that term very, very loosely, that still, to my knowledge, is advertising on Fox News and on different conservative radio stations, and is promoted by Sean Hannity and Rush Limbaugh and the like. Still very much a powerful force in these conversations today.
Well, I mean, it's not being advertised by Rush Limbaugh anymore, at least.
Fair to say, my reference was out of date. I apologize on that one.
It's being advertised on whoever is replacing Limbaugh.
Right. Oh goodness.
Oh,
go ahead.
I was just gonna say, so like the modern evangelicalism of these anti-trans, anti-gay culture war movements is really a product of our parents' generation and reacting to the civil rights movement and stuff. Like, transness wasn't really acceptable necessarily in society, but I went through the newspaper archives of the Star Tribune, which is our big local paper here in Minnesota, because the University of Minnesota was one of the first places to do gender confirmation surgeries for trans people way back in the 60s. And the way they're written about pre-moral majority and then post-moral majority is so different, because the first one is just this sort of we're just reporting what this is. We are calmly explaining what transsexualism is, and what the surgery entails. And then afterwards, it was some people believe this is a controversial thing to do, and sort of trying to balance it. So it's really fascinating to see how that sneaks into the rhetoric as well.
I remember reading the newspaper article about Christy. What was her name? You said it earlier. I forgot.
Christine Jorgensen.
Yes, Christine Jorgensen. I remember reading that and being like, oh, this isn't negative at all. Like, this is like World War II era or something. And it's not negative. It's just like, wow, this is a medical marvel. The he is now a she. Look at this. Medicine's come so far. Science is doing so much. It wasn't anything moralistic or anything like that. It was just like, look at how gorgeous this woman is now. Holy shit. And I remember being like, what the fuck changed? There's no way I would even read an article like that today.
Yeah.
That's fair to say, and it really is worth highlighting just how much of these conversations are happening because of such intentional misinformation. You know, we're at a bizarre moment in our own cultural history and politics as we are trying to grapple with mass media and what Facebook's responsibility and the election tampering, and we're trying to work through all of this as misinformation has really taken a technological leap. But it's important to remember that, particularly when we're talking about our gender and our sexuality, that these conversations have been heavily leaned on, and there's been somebody with their thumb on the scale for so much of our recent, historically speaking, our recent history, that everything that we're talking about here has to be kind of skewed by this sort of like black hole that we've been swirling around.
Yeah, the current media narrative has memory hold a whole ton of information about trans people. And you can see it particularly, like, one of the ways that I saw it was in the 1990s when Boys Don't Cry came out, the Hilary Swank movie about Brendan Teena, who was a trans man who was brutally murdered in Humboldt, Nebraska. And when that movie came out, newspapers were saying, like, this is the first moment we've had to talk about trans people, and stuff. And a bunch of trans people at that time were going, what? No, like, we've been around here forever. Like, just because you're discovering it as a cis person doesn't make it new.
Yeah.